They didn't notice me until something went wrong, and by then it was already my fault. That was the unwritten rule at Linrest Dynamics, a mid-sized tech company that liked to see itself in press releases as nimble and disruptive, but which depended on a small windowless room, my room, to keep the lights from flickering and the lawsuits from landing. My title said Senior Compliance Specialist, neat and narrow as a nameplate, but the work was broader, messier, and far less photogenic. Contracts, taxes, employee classifications, wage and hour standards, OSHA checklists, international data transfer controls, export restrictions, vendor agreements that could quietly smuggle liabilities straight into quarterly earnings. If there was a detonator hidden in the building's paperwork, it passed through my hands before it could go off. The fluorescent above my desk kept a rhythm like a tired metronome, a faint stutter on the second beat I'd memorized, sometime in year 2. Towers of manila folders leaned against each other like old row houses. File drawers stuck on humid days and surrendered with a cough on dry ones. Holiday parties happened on other floors. Team photos bloomed across the break room walls like someone else's yearbook. When procurement popped champagne after closing a vendor deal, I was usually revising the indemnification clause they'd copied off a blog, the kind that looks tough until a real lawyer breathes on it. I didn't mind not being in the pictures. Visibility can be a razor. In corporate America, the ones who know where the bodies are buried are always one reorg away from becoming a body themselves. Still, I kept count, quietly. In 6 years, I prevented at least 12 potential lawsuits. The harassment complaint that never metastasized into litigation because we rewrote the reporting chain and moved a manager out of harm's way. The OSHA near miss that we documented and fixed before a surprise inspection turned it into a citation. The international trade compliance tangle that could have triggered sanctions if a rushed data transfer clause survived another day. I was the one who flagged misclassified contractors logging full-time hours for years, the one who recalculated overtime exposure when someone decided junior developers were magically exempt because their job titles sounded important. CFO Janet Morrison would slide paper under my door with sticky notes that read, "Is this going to bite us?" CEO Mark Halverson emailed me at 11:52 p.m. with subject lines like, "Need your eyes on this ASAP." They liked my diligence the way vampires like Type O, essential, consumable, and best delivered without sunlight. The social architecture of the company arranged itself to keep me out of frame. My office was at the end of a forgotten hallway beside the records archive, the kind of room you find when you get lost. New hires sometimes asked if I worked remotely because they'd never seen me. HR invited me to institutional knowledge meetings, and I learned to hear the euphemism inside the calendar invite. Teach us your job so we can replace you with a cheaper you. I drank black coffee from a chipped mug and responded to Slack threads no one read until the moment a deadline turned my advice into a fire extinguisher. I didn't yell. I didn't grandstand. Instead, I did what the quiet ones do when the loud ones won't listen. I kept careful receipts. Every memo, every email, every hallway conversation where someone said, "We'll circle back after Q4, went into a personal archive organized by date, department, and statute. That wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. You don't spend years walking a company along the edge of cliffs without documenting where the footings crack. Somewhere between years 4 and 5, the archive took on the shape of a shadow company, a secret twin built out of metadata and risk matrices, where everything that might someday matter had a timestamp and a PDF. If you want to understand the culture it served, imagine a house of cards built enthusiastically by people who never read the instructions. Then imagine a small hand steadying it every time an enthusiastic thumb pressed too hard. Sales cut promises with the confidence of gamblers playing with someone else's credit. Procurement loved industry-standard clauses they lifted from other contracts and didn't understand. HR believed policies were instruments to produce outcomes, not rules to be followed. Legal did its job, but legal was overstretched and hired to say no only on the big things. Compliance, my desk with its stuttering light, was where all the mid-sized catastrophes went to be domesticated. The shape of my days would look boring from a distance, and in the aggregate resembled triage. Morning, a vendor master services agreement whose limitation of liability section capped damages at the value of the last purchase order, effectively pricing a catastrophic breach at $28,000. Noon, an engineer who had been temporarily contracted for 38 months, leading a team of regular employees while receiving no benefits. Afternoon, a product manager insisting we could promise EU clients sovereign hosting in Frankfurt, even though our actual environment lived on U.S. infrastructure and our EU mirror was a PowerPoint slide. Late evening, an email from Mark forwarding a board member's question about compliance posture, those two words suddenly urgent in Q&A, the quarter we were courting a strategic investor. I learned to read more than text. I learned to read silence. The invite removed from a quarterly planning meeting I'd always attended. The sudden curiosity from HR about my workflows. The Deputy Director of Sales, Darren Whitmore, asking me to simplify approval gates for international contracts. That last one taught me the most. Darren was a weather vane. If he moved, storms were coming. He had that salesman's knack for making his own urgency your problem. When he pressed, what he really meant was, I've promised something I don't have the authority to promise, and your refusal to conjure it from thin air makes you the obstacle. There are eras in American corporate life defined by who gets thanked in public and who gets blamed in private. The 1980s lionized rainmakers. The 2000s taught us to love founders and product visionaries. The 2010s discovered operations as a meme, but the people who prevent disasters have never had a season. There are no TED Talks about payroll tax compliance, no Netflix docuseries about properly classifying exempt employees. The great historical narratives of business focus on the charisma of construction, not the discipline of maintenance. Yet it's maintenance that saves a company over and over in rooms without windows, under lights that stutter. History is crowded with names for the role I played. Clerks who preserved ledgers that survived empires. Archivists who saved proofs that later became indictments. Secretaries whose meeting notes revealed what speeches revised. Their stories don't make monuments, but they outlast the monuments. I thought about them when I labeled folders and standardized file names like a librarian of future prosecutions. I thought about them when I rerouted a data flow so a cross-border transfer wouldn't trigger sanctions, when I insisted that a friendly facilitation fee in a draft contract be called what it was and removed, a bribe. The logic of invisibility has a paradox built into it. The more essential you become to keeping the machine intact, the more threatening you appear to those whose power depends on improvisation. By year 6, my quiet triage had accumulated a political cost. HR wanted a backup for me just in case. Darren asked questions about how my approvals worked, the way a burglar asks about alarm systems while pretending to admire your porch lights. Conversation stopped when I entered the break room. My calendar lost a recurring invite without explanation. None of this surprised me. The first law of compliance is that proof is not merely a document, but a posture, an anticipation of the day when someone will say, you can't prove what you know. I lived as if every day were that day. The email that would send me to Dubai arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, carried in not by IT systems, but by the CEO himself. That, too, had a sound. The sudden quiet in the hallway when executives move like weather fronts. Mark folded himself into my doorway, glanced once at the beige of my walls like they were responsible for my affect. Rachel, Crescent Horizons is ready to move forward. They want extensive documentation. $25 million on the table. You're the only one who can get this through. I nodded. He did not apologize for the vacation I'd planned to take to Aspen, 5 days I'd promised myself after 3 years of canceling rest to patch someone else's oversight. I canceled. I worked 72 hours straight. I drafted 38 pages of compliance documentation, built risk matrices for scenarios they hadn't even imagined, translated our regulatory posture into language that would satisfy both U.S. and UAE law. On the overnight flight, I did what I always do, audited our own materials again, redlined a clause until the PDF looked like a battlefield, and filed a copy in the archive whose existence I never mentioned and never forgot. If the company ever wondered why I was difficult, it was because I learned early that softness is interpreted as slack in systems wired to reward friction. So I became a wall they could lean on without noticing the architecture. I didn't need them to notice. I needed them to sign the right line and keep their hands clean. In Denver, they celebrated wins. In my bunker, I prevented losses. The math of survival prefers subtraction to multipliers, but nobody prints T-shirts for liabilities avoided. Before Dubai, there were omens. HR asked me to document my core routines. Darren's team wanted a fast track for deals already essentially done. I did what I always did. I wrote it down, dated it, named the folder with a plain name that one day would read like foreshadowing. Those small motions, naming, dating, filing, felt once like housekeeping. They would become, soon enough, a weapon. What kept me steady was not anger. Not yet, but craft. There is a quiet pleasure to working a problem until the pieces fit, to making the messy world of ambition and excuse comply with statute and time. People think compliance is about saying no. They are wrong. It is about making yes lawful. The day I left for Dubai, I locked my office door and pressed my palm against the cool metal for 1 beat longer than necessary. I didn't know it yet, but the room knew, rooms sometimes do, that it would not have to hold my silence much longer. Outside, the spring light in Denver had the watery brightness of a season that believes in second chances. Inside, my archive waited like a cathedral of pages, patient, precise, and ready. The desert sky above Dubai looked less like atmosphere and more like a stage, a deep blue curtain pulled taut across a horizon built on glass. From the plane window, the city rose like an argument against physics, towers stabbing upward, lights tracing highways that stitched sand to sea. I didn't come here to marvel. I came here to close a deal. $25 million hung in the balance, a sum that meant salvation for Linrest Dynamics' fiscal year. And the only thing keeping that money from evaporating in the Arabian heat was the paper fortress I'd built in 72 sleepless hours. I should have been in Aspen. My cabin sat empty, stocked with books and firewood, waiting for the first vacation I'd planned in 3 years. Instead, I was in seat 27A, with a laptop glow burning into my retinas, red penning clauses until the text bled. The other passengers cocooned themselves in blankets and dreams while I built risk matrices and compliance appendices. By the time we touched down, I could recite the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in my sleep, and I knew exactly how to translate U.S. labor law into terms Crescent Horizons lawyers couldn't use against us. Crescent Horizons wasn't just any partner. It was a sprawling energy conglomerate with operations in 15 countries and a reputation for devouring lesser firms whole. Their headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a skyscraper that seemed less like architecture and more like a challenge to gravity. When I entered their conference room, the city sprawled below like a board game, pieces scattered across sand and shoreline. A deliberate power play. But I'd spent 6 years negotiating from a windowless bunker. You don't intimidate someone who's mastered invisibility. The CEO, Khalid al-Rashid, had a way of speaking that made words sound expensive. Every syllable placed carefully, weighed before leaving his mouth. He didn't waste air. His legal team circled like hawks, waiting to pounce on anything that smelled like weakness. export controls, international tax obligations, data sovereignty, intellectual property transfers. They fired their questions like arrows, each designed to pierce a gap. But I'd built armor from years of catching compliance violations before they detonated. Every arrow clattered harmlessly against it. For 3 days, we fenced across polished tables. They wanted hosting guarantees in Europe. I explained data residency requirements with citations ready. They probed our employment practices. I had appendices showing risk mitigation plans. They asked about liability limits. I had already mapped worst-case exposures and drafted language that narrowed them to slivers. This was not improvisation. It was choreography. Every step I took in that room had been rehearsed in my Denver bunker with fluorescent lights stuttering overhead. In that forgotten hallway, I'd trained for this moment without knowing it, and I delivered. On the morning of the 3rd day, Al-Rashid leaned back, his expression a mixture of caution and admiration. Just a few clarifications remained, but the outlines of the deal were solid. $25 million, locked down not by sales bravado or executive charisma, but by the invisible labor of a compliance specialist who had learned that the only way to survive corporate neglect was to outprepare everyone else in the room. It should have been the proudest moment of my career. Instead, when I stepped out to check my phone, I found an email that hollowed me out. Unauthorized absence, the subject read. A formal notice from HR. Sent while I was defending the company's future, it accused me of dereliction of duty. A serious breach of policy. Report immediately to HR upon return. Disciplinary action. Pending. I read it once, then twice, then a 3rd time, hoping the desert heat had warped the text. It hadn't. The CC list told the real story. The entire executive team, except for Mark Halverson, my supposed ally. At the bottom, a forward from Darren Whitmore, Deputy Director of Sales. His message: concerned about Rachel's pattern of absence without proper documentation. Please address immediately. That was the dagger. While I sat across from Al-Rashid, shielding Linrest from disaster, Darren had been in Denver, sharpening a blade with my name on it. The setup was elegant in its cruelty. Paint me as unreliable, disloyal, absent without leave. Strip away the documentation, bury the authorization emails, make me look like a rogue employee while Darren claimed the Dubai victory as his own. Corporate betrayal rarely wears a mask. It smiles, CCs the right names, and lets policy finish the job. I closed my phone, smoothed my jacket, and walked back into the conference room with a smile no one would see through. The deal closed within the hour. I signed my name under compliance guarantees worth $25 million to Linrest Dynamics. I shook hands with Al-Rashid while my company plotted my execution an ocean away. On the flight home, I didn't sleep. I opened my encrypted drive and began cataloging. 43 separate incidents came to mind immediately. Warnings ignored, memos dismissed, violations swept under rugs woven from arrogance. Each one cross-referenced, time-stamped, preserved. 6 years of silence suddenly had a voice. They wanted to frame me as absent. They had no idea I had never been more present. The irony was sharp enough to taste. Corporate America loves to talk about teamwork, about our people are our greatest asset. But history tells another story. The clerk who preserved the Pentagon Papers, the auditor who flagged Enron's lies, the engineers who warned of Challenger's O-rings. The quiet ones become scapegoats when the storm comes. I knew that truth before I boarded the plane to Dubai. By the time I landed in Denver, I knew what I had to do. The plane landed in Denver at 6:20 a.m. The Rocky Mountains stood indifferent against the horizon, but my chest tightened with a different kind of altitude. I'd just secured a $25 million deal, yet the welcome waiting for me wasn't champagne. It was the gallows dressed in HR's polite stationery. I showered, put on my sharpest charcoal suit, the one I'd once imagined wearing to federal depositions, and rehearsed what it would feel like to walk into a room where my executioners waited. It wasn't paranoia, it was history playing on repeat. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of the summons, I arrived at the glass-walled conference room HR had chosen specifically for humiliation. Glass walls are a theater. Everyone walking the corridor could glance inside and witness the ritual. Samantha Rayner from HR sat at the head, her posture erect with bureaucratic confidence. Beside her, Derek Harrison from Legal wore an expression so flat it seemed ironed. And, of course, Darren Whitmore was there, his smirk barely concealed, as if he'd been invited to his own coronation. Samantha began in her practiced monotone, reading from a 5-page document that smelled of bloodless efficiency. Failure to submit proper leave request documentation through the appropriate channels. Abandonment of essential duties without ensuring adequate coverage, causing significant disruption to ongoing compliance operations. Pattern of disregarding established protocols for international travel. Each phrase was a blade sharpened to pierce not just my record, but my identity. Darren sat back, his smirk growing wider, waiting for me to stumble, to defend myself with emotion instead of evidence. I didn't. I let her finish. Then I reached calmly into my briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd prepared at home, each document tabbed and ready. "I assume you're referring to my trip to Dubai to close the Crescent Horizons deal?" I asked. Samantha's lips tightened, but she pressed on. "The purpose of your absence is irrelevant. The issue is your failure to follow proper procedures." I slid the first document across the table. Mark Halverson's email, March 3rd, instructing me to travel to Dubai. "Note the CC to you, Samantha, and you, Derek." Their eyes flickered. I slid the second. The signed travel authorization form. March 4th. "Approved by Mark, Janet Morrison, and you, Samantha. Your digital signature is right here." She shifted in her chair but didn't touch the page. I slid the third. "The receipt from your assistant acknowledging receipt and processing of that form. March 5th. Then the 4th. My complete itinerary sent March 6th to all department heads. And, finally, the 5th. The compliance coverage plan I drafted to ensure all duties were handled during my absence. The silence that followed was heavy, like wet wool. Darren's smirk faltered, replaced by a twitch of panic. Derek leaned forward, scanning the pages with growing alarm. Samantha clung to her script. "Regardless of these documents, we're examining your behavior within a broader context of performance concerns." "What broader context?" I asked. "That's confidential," she replied, her voice brittle. Of course it was. The vagueness was the point. The paper she pushed toward me was a disciplinary notice, carefully engineered to create a record, the first domino in a line leading to termination. If I signed, they'd have grounds to fire me within 60 days. Darren practically salivated, already imagining my absence as his promotion. I signed. Then I pulled out my phone. "What are you doing?" Samantha asked. "Documenting this meeting," I replied, snapping photos of every page. "For my records. I'm sure you understand the importance of documentation." I stood, placed the pen neatly on the table, and adjusted my suit jacket. By the way, the Crescent Horizons deal closed successfully, $25 million in new revenue for Linrest. I assume that will be reflected in the broader context of my performance review. Darren finally broke. That deal was a team effort. No single person deserves— "You're right," I cut in smoothly. "It was a team effort, which is why the team won't mind when I share my detailed notes about the liability clauses I had to fix. Especially since someone, I won't mention names, made promises that violated both federal trade regulations and our own policies." His face drained of color. He knew exactly which promises I meant. I walked out of the glass box with my head high. Colleagues in the hallway pretended not to stare, but their eyes followed me, some sympathetic, some curious, some hungry for gossip. They thought they'd broken me. They thought this was the first nail in my coffin. What they didn't realize was that I'd been building my own weapon for 6 years, a cathedral of documentation, an arsenal of receipts. They wanted to play games with paperwork. They were about to learn what happens when you go to war with someone who lives in paperwork. Back in my windowless office, I locked the door, opened my laptop, and began the excavation. 14 gigabytes of evidence, 3,800 emails, hundreds of memos. Enough compliance violations to bury Linrest 10 times over. My fingers trembled not with fear, but with purpose. They wanted to call me absent. They were about to discover just how present I'd always been. The first file I opened was the oldest. A memo from 2019 written in the quiet tone of someone who still believed warnings mattered. 41 temporary contractors had been working full-time hours for 3 consecutive years, leading projects, managing staff, yet denied benefits. I had flagged it 7 separate times, citing IRS statutes that would reclassify them as employees, triggering millions in back taxes and penalties. The response from Mark Halverson was preserved in black and white. We'll revisit this after Q4. 4 years later, after Q4 still hadn't arrived. One by one, the ghosts rose from my archive. The overtime violations. Junior developers logging 60-hour weeks, classified as exempt professionals despite not meeting salary thresholds. I'd calculated the exposure at $9.4 million in unpaid overtime, not including penalties. Janet Morrison had thanked me for my concerns, then buried the analysis under budget forecasts. Darren's international sales team promising EU clients hosting guarantees that violated GDPR. 18 separate times I'd flagged it. 18 separate times the reply came back. Close first, compliance later. But the crown jewel was fresh. Darren's preliminary contracts for the Crescent Horizons deal, the ones he'd slipped to the board 3 weeks earlier. Terms that violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Facilitation payments hidden under client engagement funds. Promises of sovereign data storage we couldn't legally deliver. I had scrubbed those clauses from the final contract, but Darren's originals were still in the board's packet. He had documented his own federal crime. The deeper I dug, the more the narrative crystallized. Linrest wasn't a tech company. It was a case study in deferred accountability. Every memo I'd written was a stitch holding together a fraying fabric, and leadership had pretended not to see the seams, but I had seen them. I had kept every stitch cataloged, and now, when they tried to cut me loose, those stitches formed a noose around their necks. By Monday night, I wasn't writing a complaint. I was drafting an indictment. Not an emotional screed, but a 72-page report divided into 5 sections. 1. Employee classification violations. 23 pages detailing millions in unpaid taxes and benefits. 2. Wage and hour violations. 18 pages of forced overtime, illegal comp time, falsified records. 3. International trade and compliance. 15 pages on FCPA breaches, GDPR violations, unlawful contracts. 4. Securities and disclosure issues. 11 pages showing how violations had been hidden from investors and regulators. 5. Retaliation and cover-up. 5 pages documenting how I had been punished for raising concerns, culminating in the Dubai disciplinary action. The appendix alone ran over 300 pages. Emails, memos, annotated contracts, time-stamped warnings. It wasn't a dossier, it was a nuclear weapon. As I assembled it, I thought about whistleblowers who had come before me. Daniel Ellsberg releasing the Pentagon Papers, revealing truths presidents swore never existed. Sharon Watkins at Enron, her memos ignored until the collapse came anyway. Even the Challenger engineers, their voices muted until the O-rings burned in the sky. History doesn't remember them as complainers. It remembers them as prophets whose warnings were ignored. I wasn't Ellsberg or Watkins, but in my small corner of corporate America, I carried their lineage. Tuesday evening, my report was finished. Clinical. Devastating. Each violation paired with the statute it violated, each dismissal of my warnings preserved in its original, arrogant phrasing. It was the kind of document that made investigators salivate, airtight enough that a first-year law student could prosecute the case. Wednesday morning, I arrived at the office before dawn. The corridors were silent, the kind of silence buildings hold before storms. I brewed coffee, returned to my bunker, and opened a new email. "To whom it may concern," I typed. "Attach, please, find documentation regarding several policy clarifications I've been seeking for the past 6 years. As these matters involve federal compliance, I've taken the liberty of copying the appropriate regulatory bodies for their input." I attached the 72-page report, then the 300-page appendix. Then I typed the recipients: Mark Halverson, Janet Morrison, Samantha Rayner, Darren Whitmore, Derek Harrison, the entire board of directors. In CC, the Department of Labor, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. My finger hovered for 3 seconds. 6 years of being ignored, dismissed, betrayed. They had called me absent. They had tried to bury me in paperwork. I was about to show them what real paperwork looked like. I clicked send. At 9:01 a.m., the email left my outbox. At 9:05, my phone began to ring. By 9:12, I heard footsteps pounding down the hallway. By 9:20, the executive suite buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Subject lines in my inbox piled up. Urgent, please call. Immediate response required. Rachel, please. But I just sipped my coffee, savoring the silence inside my bunker, knowing that beyond its door, the storm had already broken. The first knock came at 9:45 a.m. Not the polite rap of a colleague, but the heavy thud of authority. I opened the door to find Tom from security, flanked by Mark Halverson and Derek Harrison. Mark's face, normally lacquered with CEO calm, was pale and cracked. "Rachel," he said, his voice wobbling, "we need to discuss your email." I smiled, sipped my coffee, and asked, "Which part would you like to clarify? The overtime violations, the contractor misclassifications, or Section 3, where I detail the FCPA breaches in Darren's Dubai contracts?" Derek swallowed hard, his skin the color of old paper. Mark tried a softer tack. "Rachel, there's been a misunderstanding. The disciplinary action, that was Darren acting outside his authority. We can resolve this internally." I gestured to the stack of unanswered emails on my laptop. "I've been trying to resolve this internally for 6 years. Now, the appropriate agencies will have their say." By 10:30 a.m., the entire building pulsed with panic. Slack channels were renamed in real time. #General became #Damage Control. #Sales Team morphed into Urgent Audit Prep. Employees whispered in clusters, some deleting files in frantic futility, not realizing the FBI would soon mirror every server. Others suddenly remembered every slight, every underpaid hour, every retaliation. They were ready to talk. At 11:15, Darren stormed into my office, his usual swagger gone, his words ragged. "You vindictive bitch," he spat. I held up my phone. "Careful, retaliation against a whistleblower is a federal crime. Would you like me to record this conversation for the FBI?" He froze, mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. Behind him, I saw employees lingering in the hallway, pretending to pass by while drinking in every word. By noon, the parking lot was crowded with black SUVs and sedans with government plates. Agents in dark suits filed in, carrying bankers' boxes and laptops. At 12:30, it sent a company-wide notice, all systems temporarily locked for maintenance. Translation: the feds were imaging hard drives. Samantha from HR made one last attempt at 2 p.m. She stepped into my office, her voice rehearsed for generosity. "Rachel, if you retract your complaint, say it was sent in error, we can offer 6-month severance, full benefits, a glowing recommendation." I laughed. "Samantha, you disciplined me for an authorized business trip while I was closing the company's biggest deal. You fabricated violations with your own signature. And now you want to buy my silence? Check Section 5 of my report, pages 68 through 72. Your name appears often." She left without another word. By 3 p.m., news vans clustered outside. The Denver Post had caught wind. By 5 the headline ran, "Denver firm under federal investigation after whistleblower complaint." Linrest stock dropped 14% in 3 days. The building was once filled with bravado and buzzwords, now sounded like a hive drenched in gasoline. Buzzing, frantic, and close to burning. The dominoes began to fall. Darren was first. At dawn the following Monday, cameras captured him being led from his home in handcuffs, charged with attempted bribery of foreign officials and conspiracy to violate the FCPA. His lawyer muttered misunderstanding into microphones, but the FBI had his emails, his WhatsApp messages, and a sworn statement from Khalid al-Rashid. Janet Morrison, the CFO, was suspended by Tuesday. The SEC had evidence she'd signed reports attesting to clean compliance while holding memos acknowledging violations. Samantha tried to vanish, resigning by email Tuesday night, but the Department of Labor already had her fingerprints on the misclassification scheme. By Wednesday, she was listed as a co-defendant. Inside Linrest, panic curdled into paranoia. Employees split into 2 camps, the deleters and the confessors. One side scrambled to erase evidence, not realizing federal agents already had copies. The other side suddenly remembered every unpaid lunch, every forced weekend, every whispered threat, and lined up to tell investigators. The board convened an emergency meeting on Thursday. Leaks described screaming matches, resignations, and lawsuits threatened. Mark Halverson tried to make a final stand Friday at 2 p.m. in an all-hands meeting. I watched a live stream someone posted on LinkedIn. The room was half empty. Mark's voice was hollow. "We will weather this storm. Linrest has survived challenges before." From the back of the room, someone shouted, "You mean the challenges Rachel warned you about?" Laughter erupted, bitter and sharp. Employees walked out mid-sentence, some carrying boxes, others leaving laptops open on desks. By 3 the sales department, the empire Darren had once ruled, had collapsed. 8 of 12 directors resigned that day. And then Darren's final gift detonated. In his panic to cover tracks, he tried to delete incriminating emails, but instead forwarded several to the all-company list. Suddenly, every remaining employee could read how he'd planned a Dubai slush fund for bribes, how he'd split vendor kickbacks with procurement. His name became radioactive. His face, plastered across evening news, no longer smirked. By Saturday, national outlets had picked up the story. The Wall Street Journal headline read, "The 6-year paper trail, how one compliance officer brought down a tech company." My photo, lifted from LinkedIn, ran beside Darren's mugshot. On social media, I was called the most dangerous woman in corporate America. Dangerous not because I lied, but because I told the truth and had proof. For 6 years, they called me invisible. Now I was unforgettable. The building looked different when I drove past it 6 weeks later. The glass facade, once gleaming with the illusions of growth and ambition, now reflected only emptiness. For lease signs hung in the lobby like epitaphs. Security guards wheeled out boxes stamped with FBI evidence seals. Linrest Dynamics, a company that had once boasted about revolutionizing tech solutions, was gone, liquidated, bankrupt, and carved apart by lawsuits that would stretch across years. The cascade of consequences had been merciless. The Department of Labor's investigation concluded Linrest owed $7.2 million in back wages and overtime, plus penalties, bringing the total to nearly $12 million. The SEC fined them another $8 million for securities fraud. The FBI's findings produced indictments against 14 executives and managers. Janet Morrison, once confident in her creative accounting, pleaded guilty to securities fraud. Samantha Rayner, who had weaponized HR policies like knives, was named in civil and criminal suits. Darren Whitmore's charges expanded: bribery, conspiracy, wire fraud, embezzlement. His assets were frozen. His wife filed for divorce. His reputation, once puffed up by false bravado, was reduced to a cautionary tale in business schools. And Mark Halverson, the CEO who thought silence could shield him, resigned on a Thursday morning. His golden parachute was voided by the very investigations he ignored. He sent me text messages in the weeks before, begging for a resolution. I never replied. He'd had 6 years to listen. He chose instead to gamble on loyalty to incompetence. In those weeks, my inbox filled with messages of a different kind. A junior accountant sent proof of expense report fraud she'd been told to bury. An engineer detailed 3,000 hours of unpaid overtime, each one logged and ignored. A contractor, classified as temporary for 4 years while managing a department, asked if she could sue. And then there were the thank yous, quiet emails from employees who had worked in fear but now felt vindicated. One line stuck with me. Rachel Miller tried to save this company for 6 years. They thanked her by trying to fire her for doing her job. Now they're learning what happens when you shoot the messenger. Sometimes the message shoots back. The whistleblower rewards came later. Over $3 million from the Department of Labor, the SEC, and the IRS combined. Money I'd never expected but accepted as a strange form of justice. I earned more from exposing Linrest than they ever paid me to save it. There was poetry in that arithmetic. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the irony. For years they had treated compliance as an obstacle, a speed bump on the road to sales glory. They dismissed my warnings as nagging, my reports as noise. And in the end, those very warnings became the wrecking ball that demolished their empire. Crescent Horizons kept its promise. Khaled al-Rashid himself called, his voice calm and deliberate. "Miss Miller, should you ever seek employment, we would be honored." They offered me the role of Chief Compliance Officer for North American operations. 3 times my old salary. An office with windows overlooking a city that valued precision over shortcuts. I accepted. On my last day in Denver, I packed a small box, a coffee mug, a photo of my dog, the jade plant that somehow thrived without sunlight. Driving past the Linrest building one final time, I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent in that bunker, filing memos no one wanted to read. The building was hollow now, but my receipts had survived. They always do. History remembers collapses not for the size of the empire, but for the tiny cracks that were ignored until the walls caved in. The Challenger shuttle, undone by O-rings engineers warned about. Enron, destroyed by memos no one acted on. Linrest Dynamics joined that lineage, another reminder that the quiet ones keep the records, and the records never lie. In Dubai, the sun set over a skyline built on ambition and risk, but also on the understanding that rules matter. My new office overlooked that skyline. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be valued, not tolerated. Before I shut down my laptop that first evening, I sent one last email. Not to Mark, Darren, Janet, or Samantha. They had already met their reckoning. This was to the employees who had thanked me, who had been underpaid, overlooked, silenced. The subject line was simple: keep documenting everything. The message even simpler: you never know when you'll need it. I hit send, then closed the lid. Outside, the city glowed with possibilities. Behind me, Linrest's ruins smoldered, its story reduced to a headline and a warning. Some people burned bridges. I simply documented the rot until the bridge collapsed under its own weight. And when it fell, I was already on the other side, building something better. They underestimated the quiet one. They always do.